The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Martin Luther King, Jr. Captain Sylvester Gardiner kept telling his wife that things were not as bad as they seemed. Gardiner's ship, the E.S. Newman, pitched and rolled among the waves as if she were a rowboat, not a 393-ton schooner, and was in serious trouble. The Newman had set sail from Providence, Rhode Island several days earlier en route for the Chesapeake Bay, but had run into a storm and been pushed off course, probably somewhere off the coast of North Carolina. His only chance of saving his crew, his wife, and his 3-year-old son Thomas, who were also on board, was to beach the Newman, to deliberately run her aground, and hope that help would come from shore. Gardiner ordered his family and his 6 crewmen to secure a hold topside. Then he sailed the Newman directly into the violent breakers. The keel struck, the schooner buckled, her timber rending and snapping, but settled whole in the pounding surf. First Mate J.B. Crandall lit the red distress torch, and Gardiner and the rest looked toward where land should be. Just how far from shore they had grounded was unknowable. He did know that in October, the life-saving services station should be manned. The sea's relentless pounding began to take the ship apart. She would go to pieces soon. Since the yawl boat had been lost, the crew would have to swim for shore if help did not arrive. Reaching the beach in such conditions would be nearly impossible, even for the best of swimmers. The chances that he and his wife would safely reach land with the 3-year-old in tow were considerably worse. Gardiner ordered a second distress signal lit. To the north, through the drizzle and fog, there was a tiny red light, but it fizzled and faded. Then a single red rocket. A life-saving crew had seen their distress call. Soon there was movement on the beach. 7 hazy figures and a pair of horses pulling a cart. Gardiner and his crew began to cheer. The sea rushed over the entire beach, bogging the lifesavers down, knocking some to their knees. Gardiner expected that they would use their loud gun to fire a line to the ship, so he instructed his crew to spread out on the deck and be ready to bring in the line. The line never came. Gardiner scrutinized the darkness for some signal from shore. Then between his ship and the shore, he noticed tow figures pushing out into the surf. To attempt to swim out was suicide. Waves washed over the 2 swimmers, and they often disappeared under mountains of water. Several times, Gardiner thought he had been swept away. The lifesavers, alternately wading, then swimming, pushed forward, fighting their way through the surf. As they reached the disintegrating hulk of the ship, their tunics tangled in life vests all but torn from their torsos, the cheering on board faltered in an instant. Gardiner focused on the faces of salvation. He noted, to his utter surprise, the lifesavers were Negroes.
The people cry mercy in the storm. Their crying was too late. Their crying was in vain. Crying, Lord, have mercy in the storm.
Today, in towns like Kill Devil Hills and Nags Head, tourism transformed the dunes and yaupon bushes of coastal North Carolina into hotels and restaurants. The art galleries and tiny backroom museums feature countless depictions of the long-gone coastal lifesavers. Occasionally, tourists come across the old photograph of the all-black Pea Island crew. Theirs are the faces of men who have weathered many storms. At the end of the photo stands a man with a striking goatee. He was Richard Etheridge, the first black keeper. During the Jim Crow era, few African Americans held positions of authority in the U.S. North Carolina, like the rest of the southern states, seemed the least likely to find African Americans in public positions of authority after the end of Reconstruction. In these communities, coastal lifesavers often achieved reputations that lent a local folklore, Some life-saving station keepers were as powerful as mayors. So it surprises visitors today that one of these stations was manned exclusively by blacks. How did this group of former slaves achieve such a powerful position? The Outer Banks was a poor region. Commercial fishing would not bring wealth into the area until well into the 20th century. Outer Bankers earned their living mostly as inlet pilots and foragers of shipwrecks.
Being on the Outer Banks during that time frame, you really had to be self-sufficient. I think that they were kind of a jack of all trades. They had to make do with what they had, whether it washed up on the shore or whether they cut it down out of the woods or pulled it out of the ground. Most of the men from the area, they were probably mainly watermen. So oystering, fishing, trapping, some people even call them probers. I think that was more of a survivor mentality, that they would find their own provisions for themselves to help them make it through the winter.
As commercial shipping increased after the Civil War, the U.S. Lifesaving Service, the forerunner of today's Coast Guard, was formed and commissioned 7 stations along the North Carolina coast in 1874. Crews consisted of a keeper and 6 surfmen. The arrival of life-saving services offered bankers a more stable source of income. In instances when a ship came ashore, the entire crew would be summoned to the scene of a wreck. Pulling their heavy life-saving equipment in a cart, using a Lyle gun was the most efficient means of saving a stranded crew. The surfmen would fire line out to the wreck and construct a pulley system that could bring survivors to safety on shore, one at a time. Using the Lyle gun kept surfmen from having to enter the turbulent waters. If a ship was beyond its range, the surfmen would have to set out to the wreck in a surfboat. Each of these procedures would take time and measure of skill, and time was often against the seafarers who found themselves stranded in the breakers.
During the heavy season, the lifesavers, the surfmen, really had little rest. During that time, there were very fierce hurricanes up and down the coast. If there weren't hurricanes, there were really serious gale winds on a constant basis. If you know the geography of the Outer Banks, it protrudes a little bit out into the Atlantic Ocean. So if you get a hurricane or storms coming up from the south, often the Outer Banks would be right in the path of those hurricanes. So they had a lot of business.
They had maybe one day off a month where they'd have to go all the way to Roanoke Island to see their family, and the travel time was enormous back then because there weren't roads, and you had to go by boat and by horse and by foot. So by the time you got home to see your family, it was time to turn around and come back. A very marshy area, it was full of mosquitoes, there was malaria out here. So I think it was really a hard job to have.
During the first years of service in North Carolina, the life-saving season only lasted the most dangerous months. Surfmen were only hired December through March and then returned to their homes April 1st, after which the stations were locked. Mariners who encountered difficulties before or after the active season were on their own, unless bankers onshore spotted them and were capable of assisting them. To make matters worse, positions in the life-saving service were made by appointment, and many keepers and crews were hired for reasons other than their ability. In 1875, after the 6th District's first year of existence, a board was appointed by Sumner Kimball, the superintendent of the life-saving service, to inspect the Carolina stations. Of the 79 lifesavers who had been appointed, the board rejected 15, including 4 keepers. One of these keepers was a teacher, another was a blacksmith, and neither had any knowledge of the sea. A third was physically unable to perform life-saving duties. In their official report, the board stated,
"The blame lies squarely in the laps of petty local politicians, whose aim it was to subordinate the service to their personal ends, their methods being to pack the stations with their own creatures, without slightest respect to use of competency."
There's no other polite way to say it. It was just filled with cronyism. These people, there were people being paid for jobs they didn't do. There were stations that were built that were not manned. Equipment was stolen out of it.
With the increasing pressure to enlist competent crew, several keepers hired black fishermen and inlet pilots who numbered among the best watermen in the area. The first black lifesavers were most often hired only in temporary basis and were assigned to the lowest ranks, the numbers 5 and 6 positions on the duty roster, or as substitutes. They also often served simultaneously in domestic roles, usually as the station's cooks. These checkerboard crews, as they were called, lined the North Carolina coast with as many as 19 blacks on the rolls of District 6 stations in the 1870s. Despite Superintendent Kimball's persistent efforts to rid the 6th District of its weak links, the Carolina service was racked by a series of disasters in the mid-1870s that cost several lives and called into question the validity of the life-saving service in the eyes of the public. On March 1, 1876, the Italian bark, the Nuovo Ottavia, struck a shoal north of the station. Even though the bark was well within its range, Keeper John Gale decided against attempting the Lau gun. The Jones Hill crew had been graded poorly in the use of the Lau by LSS officers. In fact, they had damaged the apparatus trying to execute the drill for the officials. Gale ordered his surfmen to haul the surfboat to the scene of the wreck. Men from the lighthouse, local fishermen, and their families reported seeing the surfboat clear the breakers beautifully, and by the boat's lantern, saw her come under the distressed vessel's bulwarks. The lifesavers maneuvered to the lee side of the wreck and tied up to her with the whip line. Then, breaking the chilly night, came the sound of horrified men. From shore, witnesses watched the glimmering light of the surfboat's lantern go out.
Rushed the lifeboat to be rescued. Too many jumped in at one time. They flipped it.
4 oars washed up in the surf. Then the surfboat, keel up and empty. Next, the body of one of the surfmen came ashore, rolling at the feet of the men on the beach. Only 4 Italians managed to survive by clinging desperately to a piece of wreckage that eventually washed ashore. Keeper Gale and his entire crew were lost. Just a year and a half later, disaster struck again.
The United States man-of-war steamer Huron struck 2 miles north of No. 7 station at 1:30 a.m. The foremast and main topmast have gone. The steamer is a total wreck. Help is needed immediately.
Signal Service Dispatch, Kitty Hawk, November 24th, 1877.
At this point, the life-saving stations did not open until December 1st. So when it was beached in a terrible, terrible surf here near Nag's Head, there was nobody at the life-saving stations to rescue them, the sailors. So they proceeded to be knocked off the ship one after another. Terrible chaos on the beach. The life-saving crew finally arrived, kind of a makeshift crew, and they weren't able to be effective.
Of 132 sailors, 98 drowned. Then, 2 months later, the steamer, Metropolis, met a similar fate.
At 6:05, steamship Metropolis struck on Currituck Beach, 3 miles south of Currituck Light.
Signal Service Operator, Kitty Hawk, January 31st, 1878.
The ship came ashore in the early morning, but it took more than 5 hours for the nearest lifesavers, coming from the Star-Crossed Jones station, to be notified and locate the wreck, their heavy equipment in tow. Once there, Keeper John G. Chappelle and his surfmen failed to use the life-saving apparatus correctly, alternately firing the rescue line too short or beyond its target.
State of affairs this morning, terrible. Dead bodies lying along the beach for a distance of 2 miles.
Signal Service Operator, William Davis.
85 people drowned. The 163 survivors swam or were washed ashore with almost no assistance from the lifesavers. The captain of the Metropolis, J.H. Ankers, who survived the wreck, reported on the rescue efforts.
Had the lifesavers come properly prepared, nearly everyone could have been saved. From my experience with life-saving, I consider it a farce.
Newspapers the nation over blasted the life-saving service, holding it responsible for the 206 lives and more than $500,000 in property loss in the district in less than 2 years.
It begins to be painfully clear that the terrible loss of human life which attended the shipwreck of the Metropolis on the North Carolina coast Thursday must be attributed directly to the inefficiency of the life-saving service.
Editorialist, New York World.
The best analogy I can come up to is that these old shipwrecks were like plane crashes because you had scores and scores of people drowning. And at this point, Congress had seen enough. They were putting money into this life-saving service. They wanted this to run efficiently. And all they were seeing was people drowning and keepers not really knowing how to respond to these disasters. And now it was time to take a serious look about what to do with the life-saving service.
Congress spent the spring debating the future of the life-saving service. On June 18, 1878, it passed the Life-Saving Service Act, which authorized Sumner Kimball to commission 11 new stations in the Outer Banks, increasing the number to 18. The distance between stations was thus reduced from 12 to about 6 miles, making patrols more manageable and a quicker deploy of assistance more likely. Likewise, the length of service of surfmen was increased to 8 months. By the 1878 to 79 season, the new stations were in operation, including one on Pea Island, which was designated Station 17. Pea Island was a checkerboard crew with, as was customary, the African-American surfmen serving on the lowest ranking positions on the duty roster. But even though the number of stations was increased, it did little to combat the cronyism and political wheeling and dealing that was ruining the service, especially in North Carolina. Superintendent Kimball addressed the issue by enacting stricter guidelines by which keepers and surfmen were to be selected. He also demanded a more military running of stations. To oversee the implementation of his orders, Kimball assigned Lieutenant Frank Newcomb from Washington as an outsider, independent of local political pressures. Newcomb came to understand the machinations of the service in North Carolina. When 4 lives were lost in the wreck of the schooner, M&E Henderson of Pea Island on November 30th, 1879, Newcomb was immediately joined by Inspector Charles Shoemaker, an Iowan and Union veteran, to root out the source of the persistent troubles in the district. Upon investigating Keeper George C. Daniels' report, Inspectors Shoemaker and Newcomb found some irregularities.
We cannot explain how surfman Leonidas Tillett, who by his own admission had just returned from the South Beat, on what was, by all reports, a clear night, had failed to remark about either the debris from the ship or any of the sailors.
Inspector Shoemaker suspected that he had been absent for a time on the night Henderson came ashore. District Superintendent Joseph W. Etheridge, the Outer Banker charged with overseeing the North Carolina stations, confirmed Inspector Shoemaker's suspicion. Joseph Etheridge reported,
"The keeper of Station 17 has been using his influence, directly or indirectly, to get Jesse B. Etheridge, number 1 surfman in said station, to testify falsely in the keeper's behalf in regard to said Etheridge's absence on the same day that the wreck came ashore."
Further, on the night before he would be questioned, William C. Bowser, a black surfman who had served under Daniels the previous year, sent a confidential letter to the keeper that fell into Shoemaker's hands.
"Sir, I would like to know just what kind of a tale you are going to tell about the charge of firelighting. I want to know what you are going to do. I am ordered down there tomorrow. I suppose on that, I think we had better tell the truth that we went one time on the beach as agreed. Many know it, and we should get ourselves fouled most likely. Let me hear from you tonight. Yours truly, William C. Bowser."
Under questioning, Bowser told the truth. In the past, to fatten their billfolds, he and Daniels had regularly left the station during the active season to go firelighting, the practice of hunting waterfowl from skiffs under the cover of darkness. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniels had no other choice but to admit his guilt, acknowledging that he had neglected his duty as keeper. Inspectors Newcomb and Shoemaker's discoveries tempered the wholesale enthusiasm that Congress had adopted in arguing the life-saving bill. Incompetence and neglect persisted. Unqualified or otherwise reliable men continued to find their way into the North Carolina stations, many into positions of authority. For Shoemaker and Newcomb, the chief problem was the lack of reliable keepers. Keepers had to demonstrate not merely ability, but also responsibility for the service of their crew. They had to properly prepare their men and enforce discipline. The inspectors would address the problem station by station. The Henderson affair gave them an opportunity to resolve it at Pea Island. They first recommended discharging keeper George Daniels, as well as surfmen Tillett and Midget. Under normal circumstances, the number 1 surfman would assume the keepership of the station for the remainder of the season, but both inspectors felt that conditions in the district were far worse than normal, and they urged Superintendent Kimball to take more radical action. On more than one occasion during their fall tour, the inspectors had found the cooks or lower-ranked surfmen, some of whom were black, were responsible for the only semblance of reliable service that had been encountered.
Frank Newcomb, an inspector with the U.S. Lifesaving Service, did some questioning along the beach to find out who were dependable, who were the best lifesavers, and every single time he was given the answer that Richard Etheridge, who happened to be in a position of a cook and a steward, was probably the best surfman on the entire East Coast.
A letter written jointly by both inspectors recommended that African-American Richard Etheridge, the number 6 surfman at nearby Body Island Station, be appointed the new keeper of Station 17, beginning service as soon as possible.
Richard Etheridge is 38 years of age, has a reputation of being as good a surfman as there is on the coast, black or white, can read and write intelligently, and bears a good name as a man among men with whom he is associated during his life. Taking him all in all, he seems to be a superior man for the position.
Shoemaker, the ranking officer, followed up in a letter to Superintendent Kimball.
I'm aware that no colored man holds the position of keeper in the life-saving service. I have given this matter as careful consideration as I am capable of, and have tried to weigh every argument for and against its adoption. And I'm fully convinced that the efficiency of this service at this station will be greatly enhanced by the adoption of my recommendation as set forth.
To better understand the inspector's surprising recommendations, one must understand who Richard Etheridge was. Richard Etheridge was born a slave on January 16, 1842, the property of John B. Etheridge of Manio on Roanoke Island. During his early life, like most Outer Banks slaves, he learned to work the sea, fishing, piloting boats, and combing the beach for the refuse of wrecks.
Slavery in the Outer Banks wasn't big plantation slavery like we tend to think about. The biggest slave owners owned maybe 15 slaves. It was still slavery, but they were involved in, working alongside their masters. The relationship was maybe a little bit closer. As he was coming up, he had a special relationship with his owner. There are just some circumstances that seem to point to certainly an unusual relationship that's hard to explain. For instance, John B. Etheridge, who was Richard Etheridge's owner, taught him how to read and write, despite the fact that it was against the laws of North Carolina, and he didn't do it for other slaves.
John B. Etheridge, in all likelihood, was Richard Etheridge's father, but it couldn't be recognized because, it was taboo to have children of mixed races.
After the fighting began between the states in April 1861, the Outer Banks was the site of one of the first northern invasions in February 1862. General Ambrose Burnside, the Union commander, employed black labor to build fortifications for his armies, and the Banks soon became the refugee camp for fugitive slaves.
What happens with the slave population is that slaves from the mainland begin to, swim or boat or find their way behind Union lines. And what the Union Army decides to do, General Benjamin Butler, who was called Beast Butler, he recognized that it made sense to take these fugitive slaves, this fugitive slave population, and put them to work. And eventually that leads to them forming troops.
Black troops began being enlisted by the summer of 1863. Richard Etheridge joined on September 2nd. He was 21.
Etheridge immediately began to distinguish himself. He was made a sergeant fairly quickly on, so he was commanding his own troops as an NCO.
The 36th United States Colored Troop, in which Etheridge enlisted, spent much of its first year of active duty, like most of the other black entities in the Union Army, playing secondary roles. After limited anti-guerrilla actions in North Carolina, the soldiers of the 36th served as guards at the prisoner of war camp at Point Lookout, Maryland, occasionally raiding into neighboring Virginia for contraband goods, supplies, horses, cattle, or slaves. Necessity eventually allowed the 36th to play a more prominent role in the fight for freedom and union. Composing a unit of Major General Edward Ord's Army of the James, The 36th distinguished itself in the fighting at New Market Heights during the siege of Richmond. During the battle, the Union forces overran Lee's strong position and won an important victory on the road to taking the Confederate capital. If Etheridge's rank is any indication of his involvement, his service was meritorious as he was promoted 2 days after the battle.
They eventually marched on Richmond, and it's contentious who arrived in Richmond first. The 36th Richard Etheridge's unit was about to arrive in Richmond, and a white unit ordered them to step to the side of the road, but they didn't. They picked up the pace, and it's debated who arrived first, but they were amongst the first to arrive in the Confederate capital.
While fighting on the front to end slavery, Etheridge was also active in the struggle behind Union lines to end the mistreatment of blacks. During his duty in Virginia in 1865, he and Trooper William Benson drafted the following letter to General Oliver O. Howard, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, protesting the mistreatment that blacks on Roanoke Island were suffering at the hands of the occupying army.
The white soldiers break into our houses, act as they please, steal our chickens, rob our gardens, and if anyone defends themselves against them, they are taken to the guardhouse for it. So our families having no protection when Mr. Streeter is here to protect them and will not do it.
Etheridge and Benson's letter was not merely a cry of grievance, but also a call for action.
General, we the soldiers of the 36th U.S. Colored Troop, having families at Roanoke Island, humbly petition you to favor us by removing Mr. Streeter, the present Assistant Superintendent at Roanoke Island under Captain James, in behalf of humanity, Richard Etheridge.
He was a leader early, and he stayed a leader his whole life.
At the war's close, Etheridge, now a regimental commissary sergeant, and the black troops of the Army of the James were regrouped into the 9th and 10th Cavalry and sent to Texas. This group became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. In December 1866, Etheridge left the service of Brazos Santiago's, Texas. He returned to the Outer Banks where he married. He made his living fishing and serving in the Lifesaving Service, first at Oregon Inlet in 1875, then at Body Island. This was the man that Inspectors Newcomb and Shoemaker found in the lowest ranking position. Besides his reputation as being the best surfman on the coast, Richard Etheridge also met another criteria for the inspectors in their decision to appoint him keeper at Pea Island. Service in Carolina meant living in close quarters with one another for 8 months of the year, and many white surfmen did not want to live alongside blacks. After inspecting the Caffey's Inlet crew, Inspector Newcomb sent his telegram to General Superintendent Sumner Kimball.
Keeper Austin of this station would prefer a white crew if the choice were left to him.
Austin, who had inherited the crew from his predecessor, had 2 black surfmen on his duty roster. He and the other members of his white crew would only be too happy to get rid of them. Inspectors Newcomb and Shoemaker were proposing segregation to advance the interests of the life-saving service. It might seem surprising, even paradoxical today, that many whites, North and South, progressive and conservative, viewed segregation favorably in 1880. But it does, in fact, make sense. The Civil War and emancipation were remembered as moral and just sacrifices made by the nation to right the wrongs done in the name of slavery. But Americans considered Reconstruction an example of the federal abuse of power. Reconstruction had come to be seen as a sad era when a handful of radicals in the federal government tried to force a biracial democracy on the defeated South. Regardless of a person's feelings about immorality of slavery, the country as it was known before the war was turned on its head when 6 million freed people became equal citizens. The persons who only a few years before had been slaves, just 3/5 of man before the law, were enigma to most. They were much talked about and written about, but hardly understood and rarely accepted. Their place in society before circumscribed by the restrictions of their bondage forever changed the day the shackles were struck from their ankles and wrists. Segregation in their own separate but equal spaces seemed a reasonable response as a way to forestall any potential trouble. When Etheridge arrived on Pea Island to take over the keepership on February 1st, 1880, The remaining white crewmen deserted the station and returned home, outraged at the prospect of serving under a black man. Etheridge set to fill their vacancies with other black surfmen from neighboring District 6 stations. Lewis Westcott from Austin's Caffey's Inlet station was asked to join William Davis and William Daniels at Pea Island. To round out the crew of 6, William C. Bowser, Etheridge's former colleague from Body Island, would be transferred to the station. Etheridge also recruited Henry Daniel, a black waterman from Roanoke Island, and George Riley Midget, a local fisherman and Reconstruction-era justice of the peace. Inspector Newcomb visited the new crew and drilled them on procedure.
I found them, on the whole, fully as intelligent and competent to perform their duties as any crew in this district with the same amount of training.
With this, the first black crew was in place at Station 17, Body Island and Caffey's Inlet, which previously had checkerboard crews, were now all white. For the black surfmen, a new day had dawned in the life-saving service. For the present, Pea Island was President Lincoln's promise fulfilled. Richard Etheridge, much like Newman and Shoemaker, welcomed the segregation to Pea Island. His men largely felt likewise. It was a place in which they could take pride. It was a place in which they can call their own, without the fear of random, sudden dismissal if keeper changed or the political climate deteriorated. No longer would Etheridge or any of the others be subordinated to less experienced, less qualified surfmen merely because of their race. Here, Etheridge was in charge, and each man would have the possibility of attaining a rank commensurate with his skills and performance. Here, they had their equality of pay and of conditions under a man who, like each of them, was invested in seeing that equality was maintained. The rest of the spring of 1880 was relatively quiet. Etheridge and his surfmen were dismissed from duty for the summer of April 30th, free to return to their families on Roanoke Island and begin their other occupations. Periodically, Etheridge, like all other keepers, returned to the locked station to assure that all was well. In late May, 3 days after one such trip, the station caught fire, and with the light ocean breeze stoking the flames, burned to the ground. After his initial investigation, Inspector Newcomb, who'd already been a year in the Outer Banks, wrote Superintendent Kimball that lots of lying has been done by witnesses, which strengthened the suspicions about the circumstances surrounding the fire. Testimony that witnesses pointed strongly to the guilt of Adam Etheridge, who was white and held the position of the #1 surfman at nearby Station 16, to Patrick, his brother, and to William Clark.
For one, they were employed by the Life-Saving Service. They were surfmen in neighboring stations, and they did not go to Manio or respond to tell that one of the stations, was burning. They had witnessed the fire. They said they witnessed the fire, but they didn't, blow the whistle or do anything to try to put it out. Also, whoever burned the station down was familiar with life-saving stations because they had moved the powder. They kept gunpowder inside these stations so they could fire the Lao gun, and the persons had moved the gunpowder out of the station so that if somebody came to try to put the fire out, they wouldn't be blown up or killed. It's also interesting that they did it 3 days, the arsonists did it 3 days after Etheridge left. So they didn't want to hurt anybody. They didn't want to kill people. They just wanted to send a message.
The inference is that William P. Clark was employed by Patrick to set the station on fire, the object being to secure the removal of the present colored keeper, thus enabling Patrick to succeed him and giving Clark a situation as surfman in the station.
To add to that, it's likely there was resentment within the Etheridge family about Richard's appointment.
It's possible that, and it's a conclusion we come to, it's very possible that Richard Etheridge and Patrick Etheridge are cousins. So they're blood related. They knew each other growing up, as everybody did on the Outer Banks. It's a very, very small, tight community.
With Richard's appointment, both Patrick and Adam had been bypassed by their former slave for a much sought-after position. This, as much as their professional ambitions, most likely pushed them to act against the Pea Island station. General Superintendent Kimball was forced to acknowledge the truth and the warning he received from Area Superintendent Joseph W. Etheridge. The area superintendent, who was a native banker and a Union veteran, never doubted Richard Etheridge's ability, but he knew his neighbors. He knew that, whether the motivation was personal interest, racial prejudice, or some combination thereof, to put a black man in a position that too many white men wanted was a risky business in the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
My judgment has been against colored keepers and colored crews entirely. And if every man had gone through what I have, plus knew what I think I know, they would agree with me. The keeper of this station was competent, but the idea was, he is a Negro.
Sumner Kimball did not bow to the racist pressure. He recognized that he needed the competent service of his black crew in the troubled district, but he also needed the service of the white Etheridges. Prosecution of the brothers, he feared, might destroy the fragile infrastructure he was trying to construct. Patrick Etheridge went on to be the #1 surfman at Creed's Hill Station. In 1885, he won the Gold Life-Saving Medal for his heroism, saving the crew of the bark, Ephraim Williams.
He is the iconic surfman. When you go into a lot of the restaurants and, sites along the Outer Banks, you'll see this picture of a man with a rope, and that's Captain Pat.
Richard Etheridge and his crew refused to be victims of the chaos. No one was frightened away by the events of the summer. The stables were made into an impromptu station and, with an armed guard posted in the dunes to protect the supplies and lumber, they set about erecting a new station. The armed black man sent an indelible message to any would-be saboteurs about the unwillingness of the Pea Island surfmen to let themselves be trampled on. Etheridge knew the slightest error could result in his or one of his crewmen's dismissal, that inadequacies, no matter how small, could result in the reinstatement of a white keeper and crew. So he ran the station with military ardor.
He went by the book in all things. The men drilled 6 days a week. They had 1 day off by rotation, weather depending, where they could leave the station and go home, again, dependent upon the weather. They drilled with the lifeboat 1 day, where they would row out. They would launch the lifeboat into the ocean, row out. They would do what was called the capsize drill, where Richard Etheridge, the keeper, would flip the boat into the ocean, so all the men spill into the ocean. Meanwhile, he would scurry along the overturned bow, and then the men would have to right the boat, get back in, and commence rowing. All the while, the keeper, as nimble as a cat, stayed out of the water. They drilled with the Lyle gun, with the beach apparatus, twice a week.
Saturdays were general cleaning days, inside and outside the station. Sundays, Etheridge inspected the crew, read to them from the revised regulations, and quizzed them on their knowledge of procedure.
All the stations had a pressure to succeed, particularly given the wrecks in the 1870s. But at Pea Island, especially after the fire, they understood that they were under certain scrutiny. That failure there became not just, I'm an incompetent surfman or we are an incompetent crew. It seemed to say a certain thing about the black community, or maybe about black surfmen in general. So they felt a real pressure to always be the best. And so Etheridge pushed him in that way, and the individual surfmen responded.
Keeper Etheridge meticulously kept his log, in which he noted his inventory of supplies, the day-to-day conditions of the wind and surf, the number of ships sighted and the type, the patrols, who walked which beat, at what time, who they met, and when they returned. Drills and repairs might be subject to the whims of the weather. Patrols were not, except in the most extreme conditions.
Well, the beach patrols were part of the routine of the life-saving service. Of course, we didn't have technology back then. There were no radio rescue calls from ships in distress. So the surfmen actually had to walk the beach. And most stations were separated by a 6-mile stretch. But the way that the keeper at each station knew that they made their proper rounds is that the surfmen that were walking the beach, for instance, the one to the south would walk 3 miles north, and the one to the north would walk 3 miles south. And they would meet up in the middle and would exchange a token they called a surfman's check.
We found places in the logs where they found dead bodies at night. We found places where they, encountered wild animals. You got to understand that the coast here was strewn with old wrecks, and people had died all over on these wrecks, and it was kind of an eerie thing the way I imagine it. One time I was reading about Benjamin Bowser, who was the #2 surfman at Pea Island. He was walking a horse along the coast there, doing his patrol one night, and something, he never was able to determine what it was, spooked the horse. He had to go in the surf to pull it out, and it was just a disastrous time for him. But those are the kinds of little incidents that happen on a daily basis.
As if the pressure of saving lives wasn't enough to cause tension at the station, the blade of segregation was a double-edged sword. Jim Crow weighed heavily on the P Islanders.
There was a surfman named Robert Toller who came back to the station drunk one time and assaulted Etheridge. Etheridge, interestingly and oddly, defended him. He made a case for him to be kept on in the station. At one point, a surfman named Henry Daniel came back to the station and fired at it with a shotgun. In some instances, I'm certain those were just misbehaving. But it also seemed to be an expression of some sort of frustration that was building within the crew, because P Island is at once this possibility, this promise of service, at the same time that it can also maybe resemble a prison after a certain time. When you're the number 5 surfman for 17 years, without the possibility of advance, that becomes a source of frustration too.
Richard Etheridge understood that sometimes these pressures could overwhelm. Torn between his effort to enforce discipline and his need to maintain the morale of his crew, Keeper Etheridge seemed willing to make allowances.
The stories I heard, he was a hard but fair man, okay? It was important that they be professional. It was important that they were the best at what they did.
And they started having an amazing record of saving lives. The period of 1895 to 1896, they had something like 6 or 7 schooners come along shore, right in this short area of shoreline we are on right now. And they had an amazing 100%, rescue. They were at the top of their game.
All up and down the coast, sea tides were sweeping across the beach, taking every moving object into the surf. By noon, Keeper Etheridge was calling the storm a hurricane, and he wrote the baleful word in the station log. Surfmen at the stations to the north and south, terrified by the freakish tides, were abandoning their posts and seeking higher ground. Keeper Etheridge ordered his men to stay put and maintain a vigilant watch from the observation deck.
Theodore Meekins was in the lookout tower, and he saw a flare.
It just so happens that my grandfather was in the tower because beach patrols were suspended. He woke the keeper.
At P Island, Richard Etheridge ordered a flare lit from the beach to signal the ship that help was on its way.
The phone lines were down, so they couldn't talk to anybody else. They couldn't telegraph anybody and tell them what they were doing, so they were totally isolated.
Etheridge knew there wasn't much time before nothing would be left of a vessel in distress in these conditions. He ordered his men to haul out the cart. On shore, the sea was rushing over the entire beach, bogging the lifesavers down, knocking some to their knees. They pushed forward.
And in water that's knee, waist deep, they take the beach apparatus that has the Lyle gun, and they trudge 1.5 miles, 2 miles down the beach, abreast of this schooner that's come ashore.
The lifesavers could hear cheering from the grounded schooner. Keeper Etheridge assessed the situation, and it was grave.
There was no way for them to really use their equipment once they arrived abreast of the schooner, because you need a steady beach to set up the beach apparatus.
So in the spur of the moment, what Richard Etheridge does is he calls for 2 volunteers, and they tie a line between those 2 volunteers and to secure them to each other, and secure them with a line to the surfmen who are going to remain on shore. And those 2 men wade out, swim out. So the sea around the ship is turbulent, it's roiling, it's particularly violent, and it's also littered with debris. Parts of the ship have come undone, planks with nails in it. So you have things coming at you. To be in those waters is particularly dangerous. These 2 men face that. They brave it, they get out there, they get abreast of the ship.
They made it to the boat. Swimming, walking, getting pushed back by the waves, still undaunted, refusing to give up. And they made it out to the boat, tied the line off, and then they started bringing people back. 2 of them would bring somebody back. They would change a crew, send them out, until they had all the survivors off the boat.
According to local lore, Meekins, who was reputedly the best swimmer of the group, made every trip out to the Newman. When Theodore Meekins' hands reached out for Captain Gardner's, it was just one human being reaching out to help another. The storm scattered the debris of the ship from Oregon Inlet to the Kinnikit and embedded the biggest pieces violently into the dunes. Still, Captain Gardner searched for and found the pieces of the side that held the vessel's name and donated it to the crew as an offering of his thanks. The 1896 P Island crew voted to give the wooden sideboard of the Newman to the Meekins. This would be the only award the P Island crew received for their efforts for 100 years. Meekins took the board to his farm on Roanoke Island and nailed it to the top of his barn. He served at number 17 for 21 more years until his death in 1917, when, while boating home on leave, a storm came up at Oregon Inlet, and he drowned trying to swim ashore. His body washed up some months later, so badly disfigured, he could only be identified by his teeth. By that time, Richard Etheridge had also met a tragic end.
In January 1900, when Orville and Wilbur Wright were planning their voyage to Kitty Hawk to experiment with human flight,
Etheridge, at the age of 58, fell ill while serving in the station he had fought to have built. The number 1 surfman, Benjamin Bowser, took charge in his stead.
Keeper very sick at the station today, unable to perform duty.
For 4 months, too sick to be moved, Etheridge remained at the station. Then on Monday, May 8, 1900, acting keeper Bowser reported the sad news.
Keeper Richard Etheridge died at this station at 20 minutes to 7 o'clock a.m. today.
Richard Etheridge's legacy of discipline and courage survived the first Pea Island cruise and was maintained with diligence and pride by the series of black keepers who succeeded him. Service at the station became a duty that was passed on from one generation to the next, and the names that lined the logs read like a genealogical tree: Meekins, Grays, Berries, Mackeys, Collins, Bowsers. In 1915, the U.S. Lifesaving Service and the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service combined to form the United States Coast Guard. The Pea Island crew continued to get the highest of marks from Coast Guard inspectors.
Rear Admiral F.C. Billard, the Commandant of the Coast Guard in 1930, wrote of his stay at Pea Island.
I've greatly enjoyed my visit to this station today. A well-kept station and a fine-looking, snappy, and alert crew.
In the 20th century came the rise of steam-powered vessels and maritime technology. The duties of coastal lifesavers were reduced to little more than helping free the tires of automobiles stuck in the sand and watching the shores for signs of U-boats.
I was there during the war mostly, and we rescued, we rescued a lot of small boats in Pamlico Sound, and we took survivors off a ship that had been hit by a submarine. We did that during the war.
2 years after the Second World War, Pea Island, like all its sister stations, were decommissioned.
I was the last man to close the doors and turn the key to lock the door at Pea Island Coast Guard Station. It was a sad day. I had known while I was a kid, I had known about the Pea Island Coast Guard Station because there were several people from Dare County and Roanoke Island, actually, that were surfmen at that station. And I used to see them come ashore, come home in their nice-looking uniforms. And I said one day, I'm going to be one of those surfmen.
Pea Island is now a bird refuge for migrating waterfowl and seabirds, and the whole thing, it's not a tourist area other than coming and birding and bird watching and sitting on the beach. It's a very pristine area.
Richard Etheridge is now buried on the land that is now the North Carolina Aquarium in Manio. He's buried beside his wife, daughter, and his mother, Rachel Doe. Originally, the land the aquarium occupies belonged to Etheridge. The U.S. Coast Guard honored the memory of the black lifesavers on February 29, 1992, with the christening of the 110-foot United States Coast Guard cutter, Pea Island. The cutter's 14-person crew is multiracial, male and female. And 100 years after the Pea Islander's most dramatic rescue, they were finally given their due.
1896 was the date of the rescue of the E.S. Newman. 1996, 100 years later, was when the Coast Guard posthumously awarded Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island crew the Gold Life-Saving Medal. It was a long time coming. Wright and I felt, and we went and saw some Coast Guard personnel, that this really is something that should happen. And it did happen. And it was a great ceremony in Washington. The descendants from the Pea Island crew were there, as well as some of the descendants from the Gardner family. And it was a really touching and wonderful ceremony. It was really great to be part of for Wright and myself.
At the ceremony, Mr. William Bowser, 81, a former Pea Island lifesaver and cousin of surfman Benjamin Bowser, told the Coast Guard Commander Steve Rochon,
Commander, I would like to tell you something. I was afraid when I came here to the ceremony today in Washington, D.C., that I would hear the national anthem being played. Do you know why? I was afraid to come because every time I heard the national anthem being sung, I would cry. But I would cry out of anger because of how badly I was treated as a black man in those days. Now, I will still cry when I hear the national anthem, but I will cry out of joy because this day has erased 50 years of bitterness from my heart.
What happens when I talk about it is this. I become a stumbling, bumbling fool. I am here to honor the men of the Pea Island Life Saving Station on behalf of the Gardner family. The rescue occurred before my father was born. So if you look at that, if my father was born in 1901, the rescue occurred 5 years earlier, I guess there would be no Daniel Gardner. That's pretty big. So Richard Etheridge, obviously, is my hero, as are the members of his crew that worked 112 years ago to save my grandfather, my grandmother, and my Uncle Tom.
Pea Island is not just black history. It's not just about black lifesavers to impact other African Americans in the Coast Guard. It's American history. And regardless of color or race or religion or ethnicity, there's a message there for everyone.
I guess the main message that I would have to say of the Pea Island Lifesavers, is you have an important job. And all of us, depending on our various walks of life, whether you look at what you do as important or not, it probably is or it wouldn't exist. So you need to do what you do the best it can be done. And that's what they did.
These men were as close to the ultimate hero as you can get. They considered themselves average folks, but they certainly were the embodiment of every positive role model that you can think of. And yet America has somehow forgotten these, what one author calls these peaceful heroes. So we hope that part of our job is to not let America forget.